Misty Green, and you're listening to the I Lead Misty Blue podcast, where strategy meets soul and faith finds its voice. If you listened to the last episode, The Drift, then you already know that Samson's story, it doesn't begin with Delilah, and it certainly doesn't begin with something as simple as a haircut. No. Long before the woman, whose name is always associated with Samson had already began to do what? He began to make small decisions regularly that slowly shifted him away from his purpose. And they moved him closer to the things that God had placed as guardrails to protect his purpose. We talked about proximity. We talked about that road to Timnah, the vineyards along the way, the lion that came roaring out of nowhere, and the honey that Samson later scooped from the carcass of the very thing that he had once defeated. We talked about what it means to reach back into something dead because something sweet is still inside of it. And we talked about how the drift rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time, it simply looks like one decision that seems manageable, followed by another, and then another. What I want to do today is to stay in that part of Samson's life just a little bit longer, because this is where his story gets far more interesting than the version many of us heard growing up in our Sunday school class. We're not still at Delilah. No, we're not even close yet. There's an entire stretch of Samson's life between that vineyard and that famous relationship that we're all taught about. And when you really look at it, you really dive into his story, you begin to see how a man who had been called by God, empowered by God, purposed by God, and given extraordinary strength could slowly begin using that very gift in ways that looked less and less like purpose and more like personal desire, like pride, like revenge, retaliation. Before we go any further, I want to remind you of something from the beginning of Samson's story. He wasn't chosen because he was strong. His strength became extraordinary because he had been chosen. Before Samson ever knew what his body would be capable of, God had already spoken purpose over his life. His mother had been told that this child would be set apart and that he would begin the work of delivering Israel from the Philistines. See, that matters because Samson's power was never meant to exist without purpose. His strength was not simply a gift he could use however he wanted to. No, it was attached to an assignment. And that is why the guardrails mattered so much. See, the Nazirite instructions around Samson's life were not random. He was not to drink wine or any strong drink or consume what came from the vine. He was not to come into contact with what was dead, and no razor was to touch his head. These three guardrails don't seem very intense to me, especially if these are the only guardrails set around such extraordinary strength, such extraordinary gifting. Those were not arbitrary restrictions meant to make Samson miserable. They marked a life that had been set apart. They were reminders that what Samson carried belonged to something far greater than himself. Yet, Samson's story begins showing us how quickly a guardrail can become something we negotiate once we become convinced that we are strong enough to manage what it was designed to keep us away from. And that takes us back to Timnah. Samson had gone down to Timnah and seen a Philistine woman in the town. When he came home, he told his parents he wanted her as his wife. His parents were extremely concerned, and understandably so. See, the Philistines were not simply another neighboring people group. No, they were the very people who, in that time, were oppressing Israel, the same people Samson had been called to begin delivering Israel from. His parents asked whether there was not a woman among their own people that he could marry instead, but Samson had already decided. He had seen her and he wanted her. And scripture records his response in a way that I think tells us something important about him. He wanted her because she was right in his eyes. I keep coming back to that phrase because there's something deeply human in it. Samson wasn't standing in his parents' home saying, I reject God. No, that's not what he's saying overtly. He wasn't declaring that his calling no longer mattered. No, he was simply allowing what looked right to him to become far more important than the wisdom being offered to him. And that is how proximity and the drift often work. We don't always abandon God in one dramatic moment. Sometimes we simply begin trusting ourselves and our own desires a little bit more. We give our own judgment a little bit more authority. We start saying, I know what I'm doing. And before long, our desires are no longer being examined through discernment and through purpose and through alignment. No, they're simply driving all of it. What makes this part of the story even more interesting is that scripture tells us Samson's parents didn't understand that God was already working through the situation to create an opportunity against the Philistines. And I love that detail because it reminds us that God's sovereignty isn't dependent upon our perfect or imperfect motives. No, God can work through complicated decisions, and He can even work through those of us who are stubborn and imperfect relationships, and He can work through, and His sovereignty will show itself strong even in the midst of human mess without necessarily endorsing every motive or every desire we may have. No, God's purpose will still show itself strong, even in the midst of our chaos and our decisions and our desires. That distinction matters. God can use something without approving of everything it produced. I'm going to say that again. See, God can use something without approving every detail within what is producing. Samson wanted the woman because she pleased him. God would use the situation for a much larger purpose. And both things can be true at the same time. This goes back to our conversation around God's perfect versus God's permissible will. So Samson and his parents traveled toward Timnah, and somewhere along that journey, near the vineyards, so we're there again, a young lion comes roaring toward him. This is where episode 1 began to open up for me. Samson is walking through a place already connected to one of the guardrails around his life, and suddenly he is confronted by a lion. Scripture says the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him so powerfully that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands. Imagine that moment. No sword, no weapon, no preparation, no anything. Just off the cuff, a lion, a young man, and the power of God meeting him in the middle of a road that he most likely shouldn't have been on anyway. And Samson wins. He defeats the lion. He doesn't even tell his parents what happened. I think that's interesting. And the journey continues. Eventually, Samson returns toward Timnah for the wedding. And that's where Samson does something I think we rush past far too quickly. And I don't know about you, but this part of the story never landed for me or was never shared during the stories of Samson I heard in Sunday school. Samson turns aside from the road. He goes back to look at the lion that he had killed. And I find that detail fascinating because Samson is on his way toward what he believes is his future, yet he steps off the path to revisit something from his past. Isn't that so human? He wants to see what happened to the thing he defeated or the thing he had visited before. And inside the carcass, bees have made honey. There's sweetness sitting inside of death. Samson reaches in and he does what? He scoops the honey out with his hands. He eats it. And then, because he couldn't sit there alone, he takes some to his parents. They eat it too, but Samson never tells them where it came from. And see, that piece matters. Samson knew where the honey came from, but his parents didn't. He wasn't only stepping across a guardrail himself, now he was bringing other people into something without giving them the information they would have needed to choose differently. That's what compromise can do when we stop seeing it as compromise. Eventually, we stop keeping it contained because we want others to be in our mess with us, and we start sharing the honey. We start inviting other people into things we have already rationalized without ever telling them the whole story. And still, Samson is what? He is purposed and he is strong. That's what continues to strike me about this man. He steps into the vineyard, he reaches into the carcass, he feeds from something dead, he carries the honey to his parents, and nothing appears to be happening on the surface. See, Samson is still called, he's still gifted, he's still physically powerful, and he's walking toward a future that looks intact. He's going to gain what he desires. There's no immediate consequence that said, you crossed the line. And I think that's where people can become very confused about grace. I've been there myself. Sometimes God's mercy allows us time we didn't earn. And instead of using that time to realign ourselves, we interpret it as proof that what we're doing must be fine. Samson keeps surviving himself. I'm going to repeat that. Samson keeps surviving himself. He keeps surviving his own decisions. He keeps surviving his own proximity to guardrails that were put in place to protect him. And every time he survives, I imagine it becomes a little easier for him to believe he understands his own limits better than the guardrails did. Then we arrive at the wedding feast. So now we're moving forward. This is one of those portions of Samson's story that many of us were never, ever really taught in detail. And I think that it's unfortunate because it tells us so much about the man he was already turning into. Samson's father prepares the wedding celebration, and 30 Philistine men are brought into the gathering. Samson decides to give them a riddle. And there's a wager that's attached to it. If they can solve the riddle, Samson will give them 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. If they can't solve it, they owe him the same. Now, see, on the surface, it may sound like a harmless entertainment of sorts at a wedding feast. But there's something about Samson's personality beginning to show itself here. And that's where I found pause in the scripture. He knows the answer to a riddle no one else could possibly know, because the riddle comes from his private experience with the lion and the honey, a story he has shared with no one. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. That was the riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. The men have no reasonable way to be able to solve it. They don't even know where to start. And Samson knew that. I can't help but think about the way we sometimes use our own intelligence, our own humor and sarcasm, our own strength and experience, or even position to put ourselves above other people in subtle ways. It happens all the time. And we even call it joking. We call it, being funny or being clever, having great personality. We sometimes even call it, if we're being honest, competition. Sometimes the person on the other end, though, on the other side, they experience it as humiliation and condescending. The Philistine men, they couldn't solve Samson's riddle. There was no possible way. So as the days passed, frustration grew. And eventually they go to Samson's wife and they threaten her. They tell her that if she doesn't get the answer from Samson, they're going to burn her and her father's household. Think about what's happening here. This woman is now terrified. She's just entered into a marriage, and suddenly men from her own community are threatening to burn her alive because of the acts of her husband. She doesn't go to Samson and tell him what they have said to her. No, she doesn't tell him about the threat. She doesn't trust him with the threat yet. Instead, she goes into action. She begins to try to resolve the situation, and she begins pressing Samson for the answer to the riddle. She cries and she tells him that he must hate her. She tells him that if he loved her, he would tell her what the riddle means. This continues, not once and not twice, but day after day. Eventually, Samson gets so irritated that he simply tells her the answer to the riddle, and she immediately gives that answer to the Philistine men. They return to Samson with the answer to the riddle. Samson knew exactly how they got the answer. And I find this moment important because long before Delilah ever enters Samson's life, he's already experienced a pattern that looks remarkably familiar. A woman close to him is pressured by her own people. So what does she do? She pressures Samson. Samson becomes annoyed, irritated, and worn down, and he does what? He gives the woman closest to him private information. She gives that information to the men. The information is then what? It's used against him. This happened long before Delilah ever entered the story, and that matters. We often tell Samson's story as if he was completely unfamiliar with what manipulation through intimacy looked like when Delilah came along. But he wasn't. He had lived a version of it already. And his response to this initial betrayal, it was anger. And this is where Samson's strength begins to look increasingly complicated, at least to me. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson, and Samson goes down to Ashkelon and kills 30 men. He takes their belongings and he gives the clothing to the men who solved the riddle. Think about this strange tension here. It doesn't even really make sense. God's power is still moving through Samson, yet Samson's motivation has become completely personal. He's angry. He's been humiliated because these men solved the riddle. He's lost the wager, so now he's upset about that. And now 30 men are dead. Then Samson leaves and he returns home because he's angry at his wife. He returns back to his father and his mother's home. And his wife, he leaves her behind. Her father assumed that Samson hated her and that he was never coming back for her. So he gives Samson's wife in marriage to Samson's best man, the man who had served in his wedding as his companion. Later in scripture, Samson returns to his wife. And this is the part of the story that's almost painfully ordinary in the way it begins. He shows up with a young goat, basically as an apology and as a good deed. And he expects to see and spend time with his wife. And maybe he believes enough time has passed for things to cool down. Maybe he believes that not only she is calm in this moment, but his own anger has passed. Maybe in his mind, the marriage will just resume without true repair. But her father, he wasn't going to let him be with his daughter. He told Samson that he believed Samson hated her for what she had done, given the riddle information to the Philistines. So he gave her to another man. Then, in the most strange way, the father, who gave the other daughter away, now offers Samson the younger sister instead. I mean, can you even imagine the insult of all of this for everyone involved? Samson arrives expecting his wife and discovers she's been given to his best man or his best friend. And once again, what happens? Rage takes over because pride has been hit. Samson says that this time he can't be blamed for what he's about to do to the Philistines. And I want to stay with that sentence. This time, out of all the other times, Samson actually says out loud, this time, I can't be blamed. See, that sounds so extremely human to me. Have you ever noticed how easily anger can turn into permission? Someone hurts us, and suddenly we begin giving ourselves permission to act outside of our character. They did this to me. They embarrassed me. They hurt me. They lied to me. So now they deserve what happens next. Samson's calling was to begin delivering Israel from Philistine oppression. But listen to the language he's using now, the language that governs his life and his actions. It's becoming so personal. You hurt me, so I'm going to use the gift that was given to me to now hurt you. Samson catches 300 foxes. He ties their tails together, and then he attaches torches to the foxes' tails. He lights the torches and sends the animals running through the Philistine fields. The grain, vineyards, olive groves, they're all destroyed. It is an extraordinary act of retaliation. And here comes the vineyard again. Yeah, the vineyard was here again, shows up again. The very place that once represented proximity and temptation in Samson's own life is now part of the destruction he unleashes on someone else. When the Philistines discover who caused the devastation, they ask Samson, "Why did you do it?" And they learn that Samson was angry because his wife had been given to another man. So what happens now? Everything is escalating. That's how conflict works. And they retaliate. They go to the woman who he had married originally and to her father. And what happens? They burn him to death. So the very thing they threatened to do if she hadn't given the answer to the riddle ends up happening to her in the end anyway. That's the heartbreaking part of this story. She had been threatened with fire if she didn't betray Samson. She betrayed Samson trying to save herself and her father, and eventually both of them are burned anyway. So proximity to these people from Samson ends up causing their very death. That is what cycles of fear and retaliation and being human and vengeance and violence, that's what they do. They keep expanding until everyone is paying for something that began somewhere else. Samson sees what the Philistines have done, and his response is not reflection. Again, it's what? It's revenge. And he attacks them viciously. Then, what does he do? He retreats to a cave in the rock of Edom. And I find the cave interesting. There's another man in scripture who we've talked about before, and we'll come back to later, where we see another man in scripture seek refuge in a cave. See, David would hide in the cave of Adullam while running from Saul. And I'm not going to stay here today, but I want you to remember it because eventually we're going to come back to the difference between Samson and David. Two men who knew what it was to be gifted, chosen, hunted, and even required to hide, yet responded to those seasons very differently. For now, though, Samson is in the rock of Edom. The Philistines come into Judah looking for him, and 3,000 men of Judah go to Samson. 3,000 of his own people, not Philistines, but Israelites. They're even getting fed up with him. They ask him what he has done. Their concern is understandable. His personal war with the Philistines has now brought danger directly to them. And Samson gives an answer that tells us exactly where his mind is. I only did to them what they did to me. And there it is. Not that God called me to deliver Israel. Not even that I am confronting oppression. It's not that I'm fulfilling the assignment on my life or operating in my purpose. No. It is very simple. I did to them what they did to me. And somewhere along the way, the mission has become what? It has become personal and it is anchored in revenge. The gift, though, it's still there. And the strength is still there. And surprisingly enough, God's power is still present. But Samson's personal anger is increasingly deciding where that strength gets pointed. And this is where his story becomes uncomfortable for anyone who's ever been really good at something, just naturally gifted, because gifting can continue operating even while motives drift or are compromised. You can still be effective while becoming extremely unhealthy. You can still lead and preach and teach and even produce and even accomplish things. And because you're still winning, nobody, including you, may realize how far your motivation has moved from where it originally began. See, Samson allows the men of Judah to tie him up and hand him over to the Philistines. When the Philistines see him bound, they begin shouting in triumph. They think they have finally got him. Then what happens? The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson because it wasn't his time yet. And the ropes on his arms, they fall. They fall away. And Samson looks around and finds the fresh jawbone of a donkey. And with that jawbone, he killed 1,000 Philistine men. 1,000. Try to imagine the physical reality of that. One man, one jawbone, and 1,000 bodies. By any human standard, it's impossible to comprehend. But again, Samson what? Samson comes out victorious. He wins. And the Spirit of the Lord empowered him, and nothing seems to be able to hold Samson. He walks away from something no ordinary person could survive. Imagine what repeated victory can do to a person who is already learning to trust his own strength. Afterward, Samson is exhausted. This is where the story echoes the prior lesson we found with the lion in a way I find almost beautiful. After the lion, there was hunger. After the battle with 1,000 men, there is thirst. Strength doesn't eliminate depletion. Strength doesn't remove exhaustion. You can win and still be empty. You can accomplish the impossible and still need something you can't provide for yourself. Samson is desperately thirsty. And this time, he does something important. He calls out to God. He acknowledges that God has given him the great victory, and he asks whether he is now going to die from thirst and fall into the hands of the Philistines. God answers. Water comes from a hollow place, and Samson drinks. His strength immediately returns, and once again, God meets him. I think about that moment because Samson's life is messy by now. There's so much pride and so much anger and so much retaliation and self reliance, and still there's grace. God gives him water. That doesn't mean every decision Samson has made was wise. It means God is still God. Grace is not the same thing as approval. Sometimes grace simply means God is giving us another opportunity to remember who our strength came from in the first place. Samson judges Israel for 20 years during the days of the Philistines. 20 years! That detail matters because it reminds us this is not a young man having one chaotic weekend. It's not a one-off or one moment. This is a life. Years are passing and patterns are truly beginning to take shape. Success is even accumulating. Samson has repeatedly done things no other person could do. He has torn apart a lion. He has killed 30 men. He has burned Philistine crops. He has fought and survived retaliation. He's broken ropes. He's killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. And every extraordinary feat has reinforced the exact same reality. He is incredibly strong and capable. But I wonder whether the gift that was meant to remind Samson of God's power slowly became the thing that convinced Samson of his own. That's one of the dangers of being successful for a very long time. Eventually, we forget how much of what we carry was given. We start calling grace expertise. We start calling favor talent. We call God's covering good judgment. We begin to believe that because we have survived difficult seasons, we must always know how to navigate them. And then Judges 16 opens up with a sentence that almost feels shocking in how casually Scripture gives it to us. Samson goes to Gaza. He sees a prostitute and he goes to her. That is essentially the only explanation that we get. It's very short. And I've always found that fascinating. This man was set apart before birth. He was called by God. He had experienced the Spirit of the Lord moving upon him repeatedly. He had judged Israel. He had seen supernatural provision. And scripture simply tells us that he saw a prostitute and he slept with her. There's no long speech, no interruption of the narrative, no explanation of how Samson got from consecration to this moment. And maybe scripture doesn't need to explain it because we've been watching. We saw the vineyard, the carcass. We saw Timnah, the desire, the anger, the rage, the revenge. We've seen the pride. And we've even seen Samson use strength for personal retaliation. And we also saw him continue to survive and overcome consequences. By the time Samson gets to Gaza, the question's no longer, how could he do this? We already know. He's self reliant. He got there one decision at a time. And that's the thing about the drift. Eventually, what would have shocked us in an earlier version of us, it becomes something the current version of us can do without even stopping to explain it or reflect on it. And Samson goes to the prostitute. The Philistines hear that Samson's in Gaza and they surround the city. They wait at the gate through the night, planning to kill him in the morning. And once again, what happens? Samson has put himself in a place of incredible vulnerability. However, he gets out. At midnight, Samson gets up, goes to the city gates, grabs the doors, and he grabs the posts, and he grabs the bars, and he pulls the entire structure straight from the ground. He puts it on his shoulders, and he carries it away. Just imagine this sight. The symbol of the city's security is literally being carried away on one man's back. It's an extraordinary display of strength. It's also in my mind one more moment Samson could easily interpret the wrong way. Because once again, he has made a reckless decision. And once again, enemies surrounded him. And once again, there should have been a consequence. And once again, Samson walks out carrying the evidence that no one could stop him. That's a dangerous combination. A gifted person, a long history of success and winning, repeated grace and mercy, and increasing pride. With a growing appetite and a belief that whatever happens, I can get out of it. Samson had spent years surviving things that should have slowed him down. Instead, survival appears to have made him bolder, made him more confident. The guardrails around his life hadn't disappeared. He had simply grown increasingly confident that he could move around them without losing anything. And maybe that's where some of us find ourselves from time to time, not in rebellion or being exposed. See, no, we're still functioning, we're still successful, we're still capable, we're still carrying the gifts that are very real. But somewhere underneath all of that, we've quietly begun to trust the gift more than the one who gave it. We've started believing that because we're good at recovering, we don't need to be as careful about what we walk into. We've mistaken resilience for permission. We even have confused surviving consequences with completely avoiding them. Samson's life reminds us that the ability to overpower something doesn't mean we're supposed to keep walking toward it. The ability to overcome something and heal from something doesn't mean you return to it. And this is where I want to stop today. Because only after all of this does Delilah enter the story. After the vineyard and the lion and the honey and the carcass and Timnah and the first marriage and the riddle, the betrayal and the anger, the frustration, the revenge, the pride, the foxes, thousands of Philistines, the water, the Gaza, the prostitute. Only after Samson lifts the gates of his city onto his shoulders and walks away once again, believing that nothing could hold him. It is then we meet Delilah. And when we meet her next time, I don't want us to meet her as the woman who destroyed Samson. Now, that would be too simple. I want us to meet her as the woman who encountered a man who had spent years learning that no rope could hold him, no enemy could overpower him, no bad decision seemed strong enough to stop him, and no guardrail seemed important enough to keep him from going where he wanted to go. That's very different from a Samson than the one many of us learned about in Sunday school. And it makes the next part of the story make a lot more sense because by the time Delilah asks Samson what could make him weak, she is asking a man who has spent most of his adult life believing he can't be made weak. This is Misty Green, and you've been listening to the I Lead Misty Blue podcast, where strategy meets soul and faith finds its voice. If there's something I want you to sit with before we leave this part of Samson's story, it's this. Success can be a beautiful thing, but success without conviction and reflection can convince us that our own strength and ability or abilities is responsible for the things that grace has been carrying all along. Sometimes the fact that we're able to still be standing doesn't mean that every road we took or every decision we made was wise. Sometimes it simply means God has been far more merciful than we deserved and than we realize. And maybe the invitation isn't to wait until the strength is gone before we remember where it came from. Next time, we'll finally meet Delilah. But for now, we have met the man who Delilah will meet.